Hey, it's Lacey, and this is Things That Go Boom. In case you don't already know this about me, I am from Oregon.
Welcome to Oregon. It's a great place to be.
That's right.
But you probably already do, because I am obnoxiously so. I have lived in, shall we say, lesser states for over 20 years now, but I will forever and always be a Pendleton-loving, crawdad-catching, proud member of the state with the beaver on its flag.
Beavers, incredible ecosystem engineers whose activity enhances
A-V-E-R-S.
So you can imagine my delight when Unicode finally introduced a long overdue beaver emoji in November 2020.
Did you know that I invented an emoji?
What?
There were a couple
Which
of us.
one?
Well, funny you should ask. The beaver emoji. And yes, I am a lesbian.
Nice beaver.
It's been really cool to have something that is contributing to the history of the internet in such a bizarre and kind of funny way.
Joan Donovan is, among other things, the emoji's creator. It's a project that came together after a chance encounter with a member of the Emoji Standards Council at South by Southwest.
As we started talking about missing emojis, it just struck me that the beaver should exist.
The proposal that Joan and others put together for the emoji argued that not only was the beaver, quote, synonymous with worldwide Canadian culture, of course, I'd also add Oregonian culture, it was, as a recent tweet had put it, quote, pretty sexist that there is an eggplant emoji, but still no beaver.
It was a lot lighter than some of the content that I had been dealing with for the last decade, including mostly hate, harassment, and incitement.
See, the beaver emoji was a very welcome break from Joan's day job.
We refer to that as the creation and distribution of intentionally false information, usually for political ends. This can be scams, hoaxes, forgeries.
You might have heard of Joan's critical research on disinformation ecosystems and the far right. She's a researcher on mis and disinformation who recently left Harvard for Boston University. And for at least the past decade, she's been working through the ins and outs of why we can't seem to agree on the facts.
It's one thing to think something is weird. It's another thing to think something is criminal.
It's a field of study that's all the more relevant as we head into another election.
Was held here. We heard chanting, we heard shouts, we heard a lot of cursing, even anti-gay slurs.
And we are going to fight like hell against the tyrannical Democrats and any Republicans who do deals with them.
There are also protests in Washington, D.C. this weekend where the Unite the Right 2 rally was set to happen.
Today on Things That Go Boom, we ask one of the foremost experts on disinformation about tobacco, Trust, the artist formerly known as Twitter, and what we can expect from the internet in the lead up to 2024. Hey there, a quick favor. Things That Go Boom is conducting an audience survey, and we'd be so grateful if you could take just a few minutes and fill it out. If you're in, please visit survey.prx.org/boom to take the survey today. That's survey.prx.org/boom. Thanks.
I grew up a punk rocker, kicking neo-Nazis out of shows in Boston and protecting my community. I have a fascination and an interest in right-wing politics. I also noticed not many people were studying it.
Joan got her start as a postdoc at UCLA, where she dug into white supremacists' use of DNA ancestry tests.
And what we found, though, in those communities was quite a plethora of excuses as to why one should still be considered white, even though their genetics point to wildly different spaces and places than their own sort of handwritten genealogy.
But that was in 2015. So, at the same time, she was also tracking the rise of MAGA and the alt-right.
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
It was a horrific scene in Charlottesville, Virginia, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence and chaos.
Joan was the person who helped the rest of us understand what disinformation and misinformation were post-2016.
Which is to say that what happens online is part of the real world and therefore is very influential in how people think and act.
So we thought it best to ask Joan what else she might see that we don't.
To be honest with you, I'm very pessimistic. And I've always been on the side of believing that things like equality, justice will happen eventually. It might take more time, but what I'm seeing with technology is that it's really outpacing our social institutions in a very big way.
The people who wield the most power in the social media landscape are actively undermining the institutions that could challenge them.
Media plays a huge role in the ways in which, let's just say, online trolls behave. And if they're getting attention from media, they'll stay on that tactic. What the Republican Party figured out very quickly is that you can use that user-generated content as your own media. And so Trump became very adept at taking the memes and the fringe theories from trolls and making them center stage media discussions. And they all looked ridiculous. You know, when the media is asking Trump about QAnon and he's grinning ear to ear because he knows it's working, right? Because this is a fringe online theory that Democrats are harming children in the basement of pizza parlors.
Fast forward to today.
Why does Musk buy Twitter? Musk doesn't buy Twitter because he wants to start a social network. He buys Twitter because he knows its value, and its value isn't in dollars, it's in political clout, and it's global. And so now you have a man with very strange ambitions, and including outright anti-Semitic, anti-trans, anti-Black viewpoints that then takes over one of the biggest social networking platforms we've ever seen.
The past year on Twitter hasn't exactly been a smooth ride, but plenty of people are still on there. And the ones that are still have influence.
The app formerly known as Twitter still bare bones functions much in the same way. But when we're analyzing technology, we're looking for A, B, C, D, actors, behavior, content, and design. How do all these four things work together? And tech companies are happy to tell you about the bad actors and the bad behaviors and the bad content, but they don't want you to look at the design of the social media system itself and say, okay, this is advantaging media manipulators and disinformers, because they don't have to substantiate anything.
A couple of weeks before we spoke with Joan, Elon Musk accused the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish anti-hate group, of chasing advertisers away from his platform.
Musk claims, without any evidence that we've seen, that the ADL statements about rising hate speech on the platform are the reason why there has been a 60% decrease in advertising.
The ADL, quote, trying to kill the platform by falsely accusing it and him of being anti-Semitic.
And then that triggered a number of white supremacists to organize this hashtag campaign, Ban the ADL.
This is something we have seen for years on 4chan. It has been the calling card of white supremacist actors like Nick Fuentes. And so when you see that start to circulate, and not just that it's happening on Twitter, but that Musk is engaging with it, he's sanctioning it, he's giving his fans the full-throated, yes, I agree. So there's no dog whistles involved in this. And I think that's very dangerous.
It's dangerous in a way that's hard to compete with, because people like Musk and Trump are in the driver's seat. And at this point, nobody really has a grip on the brakes. Now that Trump is back on X, Joan says that 2024 is likely to look about like we all know it will.
It's going to be a bit of a three-ring circus. So I think the media has to care more about what their audience wants to know and less about what people are saying to get their attention.
Because actually, according to Joan, the problem isn't quite as widespread as we might think.
And this is very similar in our politics. It didn't surprise me that it was only about 120 or so Republican pundits across platforms that were creating all of this havoc around the big lie. Years ago, when I was at Data and Society, I did a report with Becca Lewis called the Alternative Influence Network, where we showed it was about 80 white supremacists that were causing the bulk of the problems on YouTube. And so sometimes I think doing research on media manipulation and disinformation is really about showing how small the problem is showing who is advantaged, showing what behaviors they're using or what tactics, the content, but also the design of social media and how that's being leveraged against either our public health or against our democracy, which extends beyond basic fraud and grift and into this other world.
During the very early days of platforms like Facebook and Twitter, now X, they helped activists organize and mobilize against authoritarian regimes, like in the Arab Spring. And that inspired optimism. But things have changed.
I do think I was aware of Cambridge Analytica as an entity earlier. I don't know if I was tracking how they were using Facebook specifically.
When was the issue discussed with your board member, Peter Thiel?
Congresswoman, I don't know that often.
You don't know. This was the largest data scandal with respect to your company that had catastrophic impacts on the 2016 election. You don't know?
Well, Congresswoman,
Joan says that when it comes to fixing the problems that we have today, too often our politics get in the way of good policy. But when we asked about building trust, she bristled.
Oh, I never trusted any of them. I was raised on Rage Against the Machine, right? A lot of people can not trust things and still accept them as a fact. Like, I don't have to trust the government to know that Biden is president, to know that Trump is president. I don't have to trust the media to know that there was an earthquake or a flood, right? I have to trust the evidence that's being presented. And so sometimes we confuse wanting to trust an institution with the events or the facts of the matter.
But that's also not the whole story.
Every time I hear the word trust, I also think about faith. You have faith in a thing. Some of our closely held principles are about the faith we have for some kind of justice, for something to go right. So when I think about trust, I'm more on the edge of, well, I can't know it firsthand, but do I have faith or trust in this institution, in this story, in this evidence? And that's where I place my belief.
The problem is that today we're pummeled with so much information on a daily basis, with new sources popping up all the time, that it's harder to know who to put your faith in. And for younger generations who've grown up in a multipolar media landscape, that issue is compounded. Not to mention that today, it's a lot easier to just put your faith in yourself.
Young people are not just consumers like my generation, they're producers. So there's this term prosumer, producer, consumer. I hear my students say, if I'm not on Instagram, I'm invisible, because they feel like if they don't have an online presence, they don't exist in this world. And I think trust would require us to break that down and rebuild community in a way that doesn't require digital identity.
But there's also something kind of beautiful and entrepreneurial about the internet today. Joan says policy shouldn't seek to limit that entrepreneurship, but at some point, once they've reached enough people, anyone who creates media for public consumption should have to be held accountable.
Usually the most funny and banal things are the things that scale, like, a great slam dunk, cats eating pizza, right? These are the things that millions of people are going to watch. But there is this point within conspiracy theories where they jump from fringe groups online discussing something to media and politicians saying those things and repeating those things. We need to think about, well, what are the kinds of libel and defamation that are happening here? Who are the sources of that? Who is it advantaging and why? And how do we advocate for the truth, right? How do we add correction? How do we make sure that people that see a story that is completely made up are also served the correction to that?
Think about it like television or radio. If you apply for a radio license, that means you have to follow FCC rules. The same is true for television stations. And both have to keep a file of information on things like station ownership, political time, and community programming available to the public for inspection. But even with all of that regulation in place, some of the responsibility still falls on us to disentangle our online lives from our news.
It's really hard to hoax a newspaper. And if they do get hoaxed, they usually print a correction. And so staying informed sometimes means shelling out a little bit of money for a subscription, following along with reporters that you trust, and keeping an eye out for what's not being covered. So if your favorite outlets aren't covering something, ask them why.
Who your favorite outlets are, of course, might also matter. We often talk about problems in the media in relation to right-wing outlets. But Joan says that this isn't a political bias. It actually has a lot to do with the way that these news sources are networked.
So a story that happens on, let's say, the Daily Wire is going to trade up to Fox. Like, they're going to share stories. Whereas on center and left media, it's much more eye for eye kind of organized, right? You don't see the Wall Street Journal retweeting the New York Times, right?
That model might lend itself to the independence of each individual outlet, but it doesn't make the algorithms super warm and fuzzy.
So if NPR started sharing with the Washington Post and the Texas Tribune, we might see an entirely different media ecosystem emerge on center and left media.
But that doesn't mean the left is free of problems.
The only thing I'll say about the left and media manipulation is that it tends to work through omission. So when we saw the Jussie Smollett case happen, for instance,
police say Smollett paid the brothers a total of $3,500 via check.
This was a big deal. A man hoaxed a hate crime. A celebrity hoaxed a hate crime. Now, the right kept up with the trial the whole time and the conviction. Nary a word was breathed on left-wing media about the conviction of Jussie Smollett. And we have to have room for that kind of accountability in our journalism if we're going to be taken seriously.
After the break, what does regulation actually look like?
Recently, Facebook's former director of monetization, Tim Kendall, gave testimony before Congress that suggested a new policy framework assessing social media's negative effects on society. Kendall compared social media to the tobacco industry.
I've long argued that we're in a moment of tobacco 2.0.
Back in October of 2020, when Joan appeared in front of Congress, she'd recently finished this book called The Cigarette Century by Alan Brandt. The book had a chapter on the term secondhand smoke. And the story stuck with Joan because when it was coined, tobacco companies were using another term, passive smoking.
And passive smokers are your children who are in the car with you while you're smoking. And so activists and academic researchers really pushed for this notion of secondhand smoke because they felt the framing was much better. Passive smokers weren't asking to be passive smokers, right? And that term became very consequential for getting legislation to ban smoking in places like airplanes and movie theaters and classrooms. So that metaphor, though, extends to tech in the sense that not everybody wants to be a user of technology, but it's becoming more and more common that even to go to a birthday party, you have to be signed up with Facebook so you can get the event listing. And as the technology becomes more ubiquitous and embedded in our everyday lives, we have to take a consumer protections approach. Now, what's interesting when you think about social media, though, who are the consumers? We think it might be us, the average user, but the real consumers of social media are advertisers. And this is kind of interesting because they're the ones that pay the money, that make the machines turn, and we are essentially just the harvest.
Today, it's pretty clear how to protect people from secondhand smoke. You ban smoking in public places. But how do you figure out how to protect people from being forced to use harmful technology?
So it's one thing to study it because you're a brand manager and you're selling cell phones and you want to know how Samsung does next to Apple. It's another thing, though, to use these same tools of advertising inferences to study politics and meme wars, because it's also going to tell you the engagement on those kinds of posts where people are selling you ideas. And so when I think about how much Congress has really failed to act in this moment, I'm astonished by the fact that we don't have any advertising rules about truth in advertising.
The Honest Ads Act would have modernized campaign finance laws to account for online political advertising. And it would have closed the kind of loopholes, for example, that allowed Russia to run political ads in the lead up to the 2016 election. But it stalled in Congress. And Twitter, which was initially on board with the idea, is now in a very different place.
I think that politically, we're not really ready for this next generation of ads that are going to come forward, that we should know who the sponsors are. We should know who the originators are, and we're not going to because there's no law.
Joan says that fixing the problem has to start with corporate accountability, creating the kind of legislation that requires corporations to say where and how ads are financed and who they target. But the thing is, some of the big tech platforms have actively sabotaged research aimed at identifying ad sources. There's this one story about Laura Edelson. She was a graduate student at NYU in 2021.
She had built a Facebook ad observatory, and Facebook shut her down, literally removed her personal account from Facebook because she was creating the transparency that we need. As a graduate student, by the way, but I give her all the credit in the world for starting something that opened a dialogue where she personally suffered, because getting a dissertation done and having your project axed by the corporation that you're studying is awful. It's anti-intellectual, it's anti-academic, it's anti-science. But nevertheless, these companies are here for PR. They're not here for the truth.
So in addition to corporate accountability, we also need education on Capitol Hill.
The absence of policy doesn't mean there's no policy. The technology is the policy.
So say that Facebook rolls out a new feature and that feature harms people. That's a consumer protection issue. Because even when a new feature feels benign or neutral, it still has real-world consequences.
For instance, when Twitter decided to make a live streaming platform, its trust and safety supervisor at the time, Leslie Miley, said to them, someone is going to film a murder with this. Someone is going to film crimes with this. And the Twitter execs basically made the decision that that was an acceptable risk and that the benefit outweighed the harms. And we know now with things like networked incitement and all of the content that was created from January 6th, that broadcast is an incentive to go do some kinds of lawless acts. And so we're in a big issue with all of this. And I think that ultimately there's no turning back the clock. We can't uninvent the bomb here.
But we can admit to ourselves that this kind of power is not normal for us to have. And in light of that, it's a good idea to get back to the root of public life.
We got to get back to the local net. We got to care about information that serves the public. We have to build a public interest internet. If we're going to have our politics play out on these same platforms, we need more accountability on politicians, not less.
The consequence of failing to act is no less than our global security, but also our democracy.
If we think about what kind of power is held in a network, we're actually talking about what kind of power is held by the state. The state is an organized network. Now, if I were to tell you that the richest man in the world bought an incredibly consequential network, and he is now training minions to follow his lead, you'd be like, oh, that sounds like a threat to national security. And I'd be like, yeah, it probably is, right? Because you have a man who probably believes more in a constitutional monarchy than in a democracy, with the capacity to reach hundreds of millions of people all across the world. And that power is something that we don't think about in terms of info war, but this is information warfare. And if he can cut off presidents from reaching their populace, it's time to build a lateral technology that allows us to do these kinds of things as a state.
There is some reason to be hopeful. Joan's field of study has grown by leaps and bounds over the past decade. People are talking more about media manipulation and white nationalism.
I'll tell you, when we started our project on DNA ancestry testing and white supremacy at UCLA, we were essentially joked about. Oh, that's so fringe. That's so crazy. What are you going to learn from them? The truth is a lot.
Joan says her battle, to be clear, is not with the right wing.
It's with the extremism. And so any gradation, any sunlight I can poke in between these groups of people and say, this is within the Overton window Republican politics, and this is extremism, and this is where extremism is leading the party, then I'm happy to do it. And to be honest with you, I don't get a lot of flack from the right for my research. They get it. They understand, they see it as historical. Literally every sentence is cited, right? So we don't pull punches, we don't embellish the facts. We don't need to. Because when you study extremists, they're happy to completely tell you their whole plan and how they're going to do it. For me, it's an important field of study because if we're ever going to understand each other, we're going to have to know what the differences are. And we're going to have to be clear. Some people might say to me, distinctions without a difference, right? And I don't agree. I think that politics are intimately personal. We arrive at them through highly social means. That is, we learn them from generations before us. And so it's important that we know what the mistakes were of prior generations and how to not repeat them in the future.
Unfortunately, the ups and downs of Joan's field of study are almost as intense as the politics they're tied up in.
Once research got bound up in politics, capital P. So research on extremism gets bound up with capital P politics during MAGA, the era of MAGA and Trump. And we start to see funding dwindle away. We start to see interest in our field dwindle away. Not because people became disinterested in the topic. Misinformation is more popular than ever. However, our field has become so politicized that it's dangerous to do this work.
In 2019, Joan landed a position at Harvard leading a research project into technology and social change. And in 2021, that project received documents leaked by Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen.
When you have a system that you know can be hacked with anger, and publishers are saying, oh, if I do more angry, polarizing, divisive content, I get more money. Facebook has set up a system of incentives that is pulling people apart.
The work raised Joan's profile even further, which, according to reporting from the Harvard Crimson, contributed to professional jealousy, which led to her project being shut down and her being shown the door. But Joan also told the Washington Post of her move to Boston University that, quote, BU is not as tied up with tech company money as other university systems. Harvard University received a $500 million donation from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative in 2021, right when Joan has said she started to have her initial problems. Joan declined to talk about the move in our interview, but she did tell us that when it comes to money, the landscape has shifted.
We've seen tech companies invest more in universities than we've ever seen before in the past. You have Facebook and Google in particular investing in scholarship in a way that muddies the waters on what scholarship is.
Meanwhile, 2 state attorneys general have won early rounds of lawsuits accusing academics like Alex Stamos of censorship of conservative content.
Is it legal for tech companies to coordinate to censor the political views of Americans?
And Representative Jim Jordan from Ohio, he's demanded documents and testimony from other researchers accused of bias in his role as chair of the House Judiciary Committee and its newly formed Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government.
A ploy? It's not a ploy when the FBI pays Twitter $3 million. Not one, not two, $3 million to censor American citizens.
Whether in academics or business or policy, the line between fact and politics is so blurred at this point, no human should be expected to tease those layers apart on their own. And where we thought or hoped that the policy we'd need to protect ourselves would be easy to put in place, it's not.
And the danger is now, well, how do you stop men, it's always men, who are densely connected and at the helm from using that network capacity to destroy the state? And so it's hard to imagine because of the idyllic way that we remember America. The biggest meme war that's been being fought for hundreds of years is who gets to be American, who counts. In the U.S., race and race war has been the penultimate wedge issue of our time. And that's not going to stop. And so we have to think about, well, how does this all intersect? How does this match up with the digital? How does the digital mobilize the public? How does the public stay informed? And then how do we build systems that modernize our social institutions so that we're not so susceptible to a man in the tweets?
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you still have questions about the internet and you have not sent them over, you have a teeny tiny bit of time. This is your last chance. We will answer your questions in a special episode at the end of the season. So get them over to boom@inkstickmedia.com now. This episode was produced by Zoe Sullivan and me and edited by Christina Stella, Nikki Galtland, and Sahar Khan. Our music is composed by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes our show sound its very best. Thank you, as always, to our supporters, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We will see you right back here in 2 weeks.
But I love the history of Warsaw where like they were forcing this kind of like bland communism on them. And so they were just like, we're just going to put neon everywhere. Like, fuck it. It's kind of cool because you go through the city and you're like, why is there so much neon? But it's part of the political pushback.
From